Plutarch, the makers of Rome. Chapter 1, Coriolanus. Floruit circa 490 BC. The patrician house of the Marquis at Rome produced many men of distinction. One of them was Gaius Marcius, the grandson of Numa, on his daughter's side, who succeeded to the throne after the death of Tullus Hostilius. Publius and Quintus Marcius, the men who provided Rome with its best and most abundant supply of water, also belonged to this family, as did Censorinus, who after he had twice been appointed censor by the Roman people, persuaded them to pass a law which prohibited any man from holding this office for a second term. Gaius Marcius, the subject of this life, lost his father when he was young and was brought up by his mother, who never remarried. His example shows us that the loss of a father, even though it may impose other disadvantages on a boy, does not prevent him from living a virtuous or a distinguished life, and that it is only worthless men who seek to excuse the deterioration of their character by pleading neglect in their early years. On the other hand, this same Gaius Marcius's career bears witness to the truth of the view that a naturally generous and noble disposition, if it lacks discipline, will produce both good and evil fruits at once, in the same way as a naturally fertile soil if it does not receive the proper tilling. Coriolanus' energy of mind and strength of purpose constantly led him to attempt ambitious exploits, the results of which were momentous for Rome. But these qualities were combined with a violent temper and an uncompromising self-assertion, which made it difficult for him to cooperate with others. People could admire his indifference to hardship, to pleasure, and to the temptations of money, which they dignified by the names of courage, moderation, and probity. But when he displayed the same qualities in his dealings with his fellow citizens, they were offended and found him harsh, ungracious, and overbearing. It is my belief that of all the blessings which men enjoy through the favor of the Muses, there is none so great as that process of taming and humanizing the natural instincts, which is wrought through education and study, so that by submitting ourselves to reason we acquire balance and learn to avoid excess. On the other hand, we must remember that the Romans of those days prized above all else the kind of virtue which finds its expression in warlike and military achievements. We have an interesting piece of evidence for this in the fact that there is only one word in the Latin vocabulary which signifies virtue, and its meaning is manly valor. Thus the Romans made courage stand for virtue in all its aspects, although it only denotes one of them. Marcius was passionately fond of warlike feats and contests, and began at once to handle arms even in his early boyhood. He believed that mere weapons are of little value in themselves, unless the soldier's natural capacities and physique are first properly developed and always kept ready for use. Accordingly, he trained his body so thoroughly for every type of combat that he acquired not only the speed of an athlete, but also such muscular strength for wrestling in close combat that few opponents could escape his grasp. At any rate, those who from time to time tested their prowess against his in feats of courage and daring used to attribute their defeat to his immense physical strength, which they found impossible to overcome and with no amount of exertion could wear out. He served his first campaign while he was still little more than a boy. This was at the time when Tarquinius Superbus, after he had been expelled from the kingship of Rome, had fought many unsuccessful battles, resolved to stake everything upon a final throw. Tarquinius's army had been recruited mainly from the tribes of Latium, but many men from other districts of Italy had rallied to his cause, and were marching against Rome. not so much because of any personal attachment to Tarquinius, but through fear and jealousy of the growing power of the Romans. In the battle which followed, during which fortune changed sides several times, Marcius, who was fighting bravely under the eye of the dictators, saw a Roman soldier struck down close by. He immediately ran up, placed himself in front of the wounded man, and killed his assailant. Later, after the Romans had won the battle, Marcius was one of the first to be crowned by the general with a garland of oak leaves. This is the civic crown which, according to Roman custom, is awarded to a man who has saved the life of a fellow citizen in battle. There are several possible explanations for the choice of this tree. It may have been intended as a compliment to the Arcadians, the tribe led by King Evander, who were the original founders of Rome, and who, according to an oracle of Apollo, were known as acorn eaters. Or it may have been a matter of mere convenience, because the Romans could easily find plenty of oak trees wherever they fought a campaign. Again, it may have been considered that an oaken wreath, which is sacred to Jupiter as the guardian of Rome, was the most fitting reward for a man who had saved the life of a fellow citizen. Besides this, the oak bears the most shapely fruit of any wild tree, and it is the strongest of all those that grow under cultivation. In the early days of the human race, it supplied both food and drink from its acorns, and from the honey found inside them, and it enabled men to catch a great number of grazing creatures and of birds for their meat, since it produced the mistletoe, from which they made birdlime for their snares. Legend has it that in this battle which I have described, Castor and Pollux appeared in the field, that immediately after the fighting they were seen in the forum, their horses foaming with sweat, and that they announced the victory by the fountain where their temple now stands. For this reason, the 15th of July, the day of the victory, was afterwards declared a festival dedicated to the Dioscuri. It would seem that to win distinction and high honors too early in life is apt to stifle the ambitions of young men, in whom the desire to excel does not go very deep, for then their thirst for appetite for fame, never very intense, is quickly satisfied. But for those strong-willed spirits with whom ambition is a ruling passion, the honors they receive serve only to spur them to greater efforts. The fire within them glows, and they respond as if some mighty wind were urging them on in pursuit of their ideal. They do not think of themselves as being rewarded for what they have already achieved, but rather as pledging themselves to the future. In this way, they feel ashamed of the possibility of falling short of the reputation they have already won, and constantly strive to make their latest actions excel it. It was in this spirit that Marcius set himself to surpass his own record in courage, and since he was always eager to attempt fresh exploits, he added one deed of valor to another and heaped spoils upon spoils, so that his later commanders found themselves vying with their predecessors in honors he deserved. In the efforts to commend him in higher terms and to pay him the honors he deserved. And indeed, of all the many campaigns and battles which the Romans fought at that time, there was not one from which Marcius returned without laurels or some mark of distinction. But while other men displayed their courage to win glory for themselves, Marcius's motive was always to please his mother. The delight that she experienced when she saw him crowned, and the tears of joy that she wept as she embraced him, these things were for him the supreme joy and felicity that life could offer. And this no doubt was the feeling which Epaminondas wished to express when he said, so the story goes, that he counted it with the greatest blessing of his whole career that his father and mother should have lived to hear of his victory at Leuctra. But he was fortunate enough to have had both his parents to rejoice and share in his triumph, whereas Marcius, who believed that he ought to lavish on his mother all the filial affection which would normally have belonged to his father, could never do enough to praise and honor Volumnia. It was his mother's will and choice which dictated his marriage, and he continued to live in the same house with her, even as his wife had borne his children. Marcius's prowess as a soldier had already earned him a great reputation and influence in Rome. When a serious political conflict broke out, the quarrel was between the Senate, which supported the interests of the rich, and the common people, who complained of the many grievous injustices which they had suffered at the hands of the moneylenders. Those who possessed a modest income had their property seized as a security or compulsorily sold, and suddenly found themselves destitute, while those who had no means at all were arrested and imprisoned. And this was done regardless of the many wounds and hardships they had suffered in the wars fought to defend their country. The last of these campaigns had been against the Sabines. The people had gone out to fight, after their richest creditors had expressly assured them that they would be treated with consideration. And the Senate had passed a decree that this undertaking would be guaranteed by the consul Marcus Valerius. But after they had fought with great courage and defeated the enemy, their creditors showed themselves as remorseless as ever, while the Senate did not even pretend to remember its promises, but again allowed them to be seized as security for their debts and dragged off to prison. It was not long before violent demonstrations and riots began to break out in the city, and the enemy soon took advantage of these disturbances to invade and devastate the countryside. But when the consuls called upon all those who were of military age to take up arms, not a man responded. In this crisis, the ruling class were again divided among themselves as how they should act. Some believed that they ought to make concessions to the poor, and that the state of the law was too strict and ought to be relaxed. Others opposed any leniency of this kind, and one of them was Marcius. He did so not because he attached any great importance to the matter of the people's debts, but rather because he regarded this as an insolent and presumptuous attempt on the part of the commons to overthrow the laws, and he sternly warned the magistrates that if they had any foresight, they would put a stop to this threat without further ado. The Senate held a number of meetings within the space of a few days to debate this question, but they failed to reach a decision. Thereupon the people suddenly assembled in a body, and after encouraging each other in their resolution, marched out of the city, seized the hill which is now known as the Sacred Mount, and established themselves beside the river Anio. They did not attempt any violence or revolutionary action, but merely shouted aloud as they marched along that they had long ago been driven out of their own city by the wealthy classes. Any part of Italy, they said, would provide them with air to breathe, water to drink, and a place to lay their bones. This was all they possessed if they stayed in Rome, except for the privilege of being wounded or dying in wars fought for the protection of the rich. These proceedings frightened the Senate, and they therefore selected from among their older members those who were the most moderate and reasonably disposed towards the people, and sent them out to negotiate. Their chief spokesman was Menenius Agrippa, and he began by appealing to the people to come to terms. Next, he put before them a frank defense of the Senate's position, and he concluded his speech with a well-known fable. Once upon a time, he told them all the parts of the human body revolted against the belly. They accused it of being the only member which sat idly in its place and contributed nothing to the common good, while the others suffered great hardships and performed great services, all for the sake of keeping its appetites supplied. But the belly only laughed at them for being so simple as not to understand that while it received all the body's nourishment, it also sent it out again and distributed it to every organ. So you see, my fellow citizens, he went on, this is exactly the part that the Senate plays. It is there that the various proposals and affairs of state are studied and transformed into action, and the decisions which we take bring results which are useful and profitable to you all. In the end, they succeeded in resolving their differences, but only after the people had asked and been granted by the Senate the right to elect 5 men to act as protectors of any citizen who might be in need of help. It is these officers who are now known as the tribunes of the people. The first men to be elected to this office were Junius Brutus and Sucinius Velutus, who had led the people when they marched out of Rome. Then, as soon as the city had been restored to unity, the people immediately hurried to enlist and enthusiastically offered the consuls their services for the war. Marcius was vexed that the people should have won a political victory at the expense of the aristocracy. But when he saw that many of the nobility shared his feelings, he reminded them that they must on no account be outdone in patriotism by the commons. On the contrary, they should prove that their superiority to the people lay in their valor rather than in their political strength. At this time, Rome was at war with the Volscian people, and the most important city in their territory was Corioli. Cominius, the consul, laid siege to it, whereupon the Volscians became alarmed that it might be captured and gathered their forces from all quarters to defend it, their intention being to force a battle in front of this city, and then attack the Romans from both sides at once. To counter this plan, Cominius divided his army into 2 groups. He himself advanced to meet the relieving force, while Titus Lardius, one of the bravest Roman soldiers of that time, who was left in charge of the siege operations. The men of Corioli, who now felt contemptuous of the weakness of the besieging force, made a sortie, attacked the Romans, and in the first engagement routed them and chased them back to their entrenchments. At this point, Marcius collected a small body of men and hurried to the rescue. He cut down the leading ranks of the enemy, checked their advance, and in a loud voice summoned the Romans to return to the fight. Marcius went into action, as Cato insisted that a soldier should do, not only with a strong sword arm, but with a powerful voice and a ferocious expression, so that his very appearance struck terror into the enemy and made him an almost irresistible opponent. Many of the Romans now rallied to support him, and the enemy fell back in panic. Not content with this, Marcius pressed on and finally drove the men of Corioli in headlong flight up to the very gates of their city. Here he saw the Romans beginning to slacken their pursuit. They had now come within range of a shower of missiles, which were being discharged from the walls, and none of them dared to think of mingling with the crowds of fugitives and so forcing their way into the city. But Marcius stood firm and exhorted them to make the attempt, cheering on his companions and shouting out that fortune had now thrown open the city to the pursuers, no less than to the pursued. Only a handful of men volunteered to follow him. But putting himself at their head, he fought his way through the enemy, rushed the gates, and broke into the city before a single man dared to oppose him. However, when the Volscians saw that only a handful of Romans, all told, had made their way inside, their courage returned and they attacked the intruders. In the hand-to-hand fighting that followed, Marcius, finding himself surrounded by a struggling mass in which friend and foe were inextricably intermingled, hewed his way out with a speed, a daring, a sheer fury of attack which passed all belief. He bore down all resistance before him, so that some of his opponents took refuge in the farthest parts of the city, while others threw down their arms, and finally Lartius was able to lead in his troops without striking a blow. After Coriolanus had been captured in this way, many of the Roman soldiers fell to looting and pillaging the city. This enraged Marcius, and he declared angrily that it was disgraceful for these soldiers, at the very moment when the consul Cominius and their fellow citizens might be engaged in a battle with the Volscian army, to be roaming the streets of Coriolanus looking for plunder or hiding from danger under the pretext of collecting the spoils of war. Only a few paid any attention to his protests. Whereupon he gathered together those who were willing to follow him and started out along the road which he had learned Cominius' army had taken. As they marched, he urged on his companions, begged them not to slacken their pace, and offered up prayer after prayer to the gods that they might not be too late for the battle, but arrive in time to share the trials and dangers of their fellow countrymen. In those days it was a custom among the Romans, when they were on the point of going into action and were preparing to gird up their tunics and take their shields in their hands, to make at the same time an unwritten will, naming their heirs in the presence of 3 or 4 witnesses. And this was what Cominius' soldiers were doing when Marcius came up with them. Some of the men were dismayed at first, when they saw him arrive covered with blood and sweat and leading no more than a handful of men. But when he ran up to the consul with a jubilant expression, stretched out his hand, and gave him the news that Coriolanus had been captured, and when Cominius embraced him and kissed him, the soldiers took courage. Some of them actually heard him speak of the victory, while others guessed what had happened, and finally they all shouted to the consul to lead them into action. Marcius then asked Cominius what was the enemy's order of battle and where their best troops had been stationed. The consul said he believed that the finest and bravest soldiers in the Volscian army were the men of Antium, and that they were posted in the center, whereupon Marcius answered, "I beg and demand of you to place us opposite them." The consul was filled with admiration at his spirit and granted his request. As soon as the armies came within range of each other and spears began to fly, Marcius ran out ahead of the Roman line. The Volscians opposite him could not face his charge, and the Romans broke through at the point where he had attacked. But the troops on either side wheeled inwards and surrounded him with their weapons, so that the consul became alarmed for his safety and dispatched some of his personal bodyguard to the rescue. A furious battle raged around Marcius, and men fell thick and fast. But Cominius' troops never slackened the pressure of their attack and finally drove the enemy from the field. When they started in pursuit, they urged Marcius, who by this time was stumbling with fatigue and the pain of his wounds, to retire to the camp. His only reply was that the victor has no business to be weary, and he immediately set off on the heels of the flying enemy. In the end, the entire Volscian army suffered a crushing defeat. Many were killed and large numbers taken prisoner. On the following day, Lartius's troops joined them, and the whole army was paraded before the consul. Cominius then mounted the rostra, and after offering up the thanks that were due to the gods for two such glorious successes, he addressed himself to Marcius. He began by paying tribute to his extraordinary exploits, some of which he had seen for himself in the battle, while the others had been reported to him by Lartius. An enormous quantity of booty, as well as prisoners and horses, had been captured, and out of these spoils he ordered Marcius to choose a 10th share for himself before anything was distributed to the rest of the army. And over and above all this, he presented him with a charger equipped with a splendid harness as a special prize for his valor. The Romans cheered this speech, whereupon Marcius stepped forward and declared that he gladly accepted the horse and was grateful for the consul's words of praise. But he felt that he must decline the other rewards because they seemed to him to represent not so much an honor as a payment for his services, and so he would be content to take his single share like the rest. But there is one special favor, he went on, which I beg may be granted me. There is a friend of mine along the Volscians whose guest I have been. He is a just and kindly man, but now he has become a prisoner, and so has lost all his wealth and happiness, and been reduced to the condition of a slave. He has suffered many misfortunes, but I should like to rescue him from one at least, the fate of being sold into bondage. These words were greeted with even louder applause, for there were even more admirers of Marcius's indifference to personal gain than of the courage he had shown on the battlefield. The very men who had felt a certain jealousy towards him on account of the extraordinary honors which he had been paid now considered that he deserved great rewards for the very reason that he would not accept them. And they were more impressed by the virtue which enabled him to despise such prizes than by the exploits for which he had earned them. For it is a nobler achievement to have mastered the use of wealth than the use of weapons, but it is nobler still to have no need for it. When the cheers which followed Marcius's speech had died down, Cominius spoke again and said, "Fellow soldiers, we cannot force a man to accept these gifts against his will. But there is another reward which he can scarcely refuse when it is offered him. I propose that we give him this impassive vote, that he shall henceforth be named Coriolanus, although you might think that his gallantry at Corioli had already earned him this title. This was the origin of his third name, Coriolanus, and the story makes it clear that Gaius was his personal name, that his second name, in this instance Marcius, was the common name of his family or clan, while the third was added afterwards and was given because of some exploit, stroke of fortune, physical peculiarity, or notable virtue. In the same way, the Greeks, in times past, used to give men names that were derived from some action. For example, Soter, the deliverer, and Callinicus, the victorious, or from a physical feature such as Physcon, the bloated, and Grippus, the hook-nosed, or from some outstanding excellence such as Yorgites, the benefactor, or Philadelphus the brotherly, or from a stroke of good fortune such as Eudaimon the lucky, the name given to the second king of the dynasty of Battus. On the other hand, some of the Greek rulers have had names given them in irony, such as Vetch. The Romans used surnames of this kind even more frequently. For example, one of the Metelli was named Diadematus, the man with a crown, because he suffered for a long time from a running sore, and was always to be seen with a bandage around his forehead. Another member of the Metellus family was named Keller the Swift, because he managed to provide for the people funeral games in which gladiators took part within such a short time after his father's death that the speed and urgency of his preparations were considered extraordinary. To this day, some Roman children take their names from the circumstances of their birth. Thus a boy may be called Proculus if he is born while his father is away from home, or Posthumus if his father is dead, or if twins are born of whom one survives while the other dies, he is called Vopiscus. Again, the Romans often give names because of physical peculiarities, and they choose not only such epithets as Sulla, the pimply, Niger the black, and Rufus the red, but also Cacus the blind and Claudius the lame. And indeed it is a wise practice to accustom men not to regard blindness or any other physical disability as a disgrace or a matter for reproach, but to answer these names as if they were their own. However, this is not the place for me to pursue this subject. The war was no sooner over than the leaders of the popular party began to stir up fresh quarrels. They had no fresh cause for complaint nor any just ground for making accusations, but they exploited the various evils which had inevitably grown out of the earlier disputes and disturbances, and made these their excuse for opposing the aristocratic party. The greater part of the countryside had been left unplanted and untilled, and the war had allowed no opportunity to arrange for supplies to be imported from other territories. The result was a severe shortage of food, and when the popular leaders saw that there were no provisions in the market, and that even if there had been, the people had no money to buy them, they spread malicious stories to effect that the rich had deliberately created the famine to revenge themselves on the people. At this moment there arrived a delegation from the people of Velitrae, who offered to hand over their city to the Romans and begged them to send out colonists to live in it. They had been attacked by a plague which had ravaged their country so terribly that barely a tenth of the whole population had survived. Those who could consider the matter without prejudice thought that this appeal from the people of Velitrae had come at a most fortunate moment, since the scarcity of food made it necessary to reduce the population at Rome, and at the same time they hoped that this seditious agitation would be broken up if the unruly elements and those who were most easily roused by the popular leaders could be purged away like some unhealthy discharge from the body. Accordingly, the consul selected a number of citizens of this type who were known to be discontented and ordered them to go and colonize Velitrae, while others were conscripted for a campaign against the Volscians. The consul's intention was to keep them too well occupied to create disturbances at home, but they also hoped that when patricians, plebeians, Rich and poor alike once more found themselves bearing arms together in the same camp and exerting themselves for the common good. They would learn to show more goodwill and to treat one another with greater tolerance. However, Sicinius and Brutus, the popular leaders, immediately intervened. They protested bitterly that this apparently harmless scheme of sending out a colony was the cover for a most dastardly outrage. In reality, the authorities were thrusting these poor citizens into a plague pit by sending them to a city where the air was full of infection and the stench of unburied corpses, and where they would live under the auspices of a strange god who was angry with his own people. And finally, as if the consuls were not satisfied with killing off some of their own fellow citizens by famine and exposing others to plague, they must also plunge the Roman people into a war of their own making. Indeed, it would seem that they were determined that the city should suffer every possible misfortune merely because it refused to remain enslaved to the rich. These speeches aroused such feelings of indignation among the people that they refused to obey the consul's orders to enlist, and were filled with suspicion against the proposed colony. The Senate was at a loss what to do, but in the meanwhile Marcius had come to feel that he was a man of importance. He cherished lofty ambitions, and since he knew that he had earned the admiration of some of the most influential men in the state, he openly took the initiative in opposing the popular leaders. Accordingly, the colony was sent out, and the men who were chosen by lot to occupy it were forced to go on pain of severe penalties. Finally, when the people flatly refused to take part in the campaign against the Volscians, Marcius organized a force made up of his own clients and as many other men as he could persuade to join him, and launched a raid on the territory of Antium. There he found large stocks of corn, and captured great numbers of prisoners and cattle. He kept none of these spoils for himself, but marched his troops back to Rome laden with booty of every kind. This success quickly produced a change of heart among the rest of the people. They envied their more fortunate fellow citizens, but were filled with anger against Marcius. They deeply resented the rapid growth of his power and reputation because they believed that it would be used against the interests of the people. Not long afterwards, however, Marcius stood for the consulship, and then the people relented and reflected what a shame it would be to insult and humiliate a man who had no superior, either for the nobility of his birth or for his courage, and who had rendered so many notable services to the state. Now it was the custom at Rome that the candidates for office should address their fellow citizens and appeal to them personally for their votes. And they would walk about in the forum dressed in a toga, but without a tunic underneath it. They did this in some cases to emphasize their humility by the simplicity of their dress, or else, if they had wounds to show, to display the evidence of their courage. Certainly the people's insistence that their candidates should present themselves ungirt and without a tunic had nothing to do with any suspicion of bribery, for it was not until long afterwards that the abuse of buying and selling votes crept in, and money began to play an important part in determining the elections. Later on, however, this process of corruption spread to the law courts and to the army, and finally, when even the sword became enslaved by the power of gold, the Republic was subjected to the rule of the emperors. For it has rightly been said that the man who first offers banquets and bribes to the people is the first to destroy their liberties. In Rome, this evil seems to have crept in stealthily and gradually, and it was many years before it became apparent. We do not know, for example, who was the first man to bribe the people or the courts of law, whereas at Athens, Anytus, the son of Anthemion, has been named as the first man to give money to jurymen. He did this when he was being tried on a charge of treason for his failure to relieve Pylos. However, this was at a time when the Golden Age still prevailed at Rome, and the Forum was dominated by men of uncorrupted virtue. So when Marcius displayed the scars he bore from the many battles in which for 17 successive years he had covered himself with glory in the defense of Rome, the people were put to shame by these proofs of his valor, and agreed among themselves that they would elect him consul. But when the polling day arrived and Marcius made an ostentatious entry into the Forum, escorted with great ceremony by the entire Senate, while the patricians who surrounded him were clearly more determined than ever to secure a victory, the people's momentary feelings of goodwill towards him quickly subsided, and their mood changed to one of envy and resentment. These sentiments were strengthened still further by the fear that if a man who wielded so much influence among the patricians and was so intensely aristocratic in his sympathies should ever hold the chief office of state, he might deprive the people of every liberty that they possessed. For these reasons, the people did not vote for Marcius. When the other candidates had been declared elected, the senators were bitterly indignant and felt that it was they rather than Marcius who had been humiliated, while he revealed that he was quite incapable of patience or self-control when faced with the reverse. He had always given free rein to the impulses of pride and aggression in his nature, as if there were some inherent grandeur or nobility in these qualities, and had never allowed himself to be ruled by reason and discipline so as to develop the combination of gravity and tolerance which is so indispensable a virtue for statesmen. He never understood that a man who aspires to play a part in public affairs must avoid above all things that tendency to self-assertion, which is in Plato's phrase the companion of solitude, but rather must mingle with men and even cultivate the capacity to submit to injury, which some people so contemptuously deride. Marcius, on the other hand, was as artless as he was obstinate, and believed that it is, under all circumstances, a brave man's duty to bear down and overwhelm all opposition. It never occurred to him that it might be a sign of weakness to be unable to restrain the anger which bursts out like an abscess from the wounded and suffering spirit, and so he went away full of indignation and rancor towards the people, the younger patricians, that section of the community which was most conscious of the nobility of its birth and most ostentatious in flaunting it, had always been fanatically devoted to Marcius, and they now rallied to his support, although in a manner that did him no good, since their expressions of sympathy and indignation served only to make his resentment more bitter. They had long regarded him as their leader, and while on active service they had found him a most congenial instructor in the art of war. since he inspired them to vie with one another in acts of courage and to rejoice in their successes without envying those of others. Meanwhile, a large consignment of grain arrived in Rome. Much of this had been purchased in Italy, but an equal amount had been sent as a gift by Gello, the tyrant of Syracuse. The people were greatly encouraged, as they hoped that this windfall would put an end not only to the scarcity of food, but also to the quarrel between patricians and plebeians. The Senate was promptly assembled, and the people waited eagerly outside the doors to hear the result of the debate. They expected that the price of grain would now fall to a reasonable figure, and that the gift to the state would be distributed free of charge. And indeed, this was the course recommended by a number of the senators. But when Marcius rose to speak, he violently attacked those who upheld the people's interests and denounced them as demagogues and traitors to the aristocracy. He argued that they were fostering to their own ultimate peril the pernicious seeds of insolence and insubordination which had been sown among the masses. They should never have allowed these to take root in the first place, and above all, they should never have conceded to the people such a powerful magistracy as the tribunate. As it was, the masses had now become formidable. Every demand which they put forward was granted, and no decision was ever imposed upon them against their will. They defied the authority of the consuls and were governed only by their own champions of misrule, whom they dignified by the title of rulers. So for the Senate to sit there and decree bounties and free distributions of grain for the whole population, just as they do in Greece, where the will of the people is apparently supreme, would amount to nothing less than to support them in their defiance of the Constitution, and would bring about the ruin of the whole state. The people will not regard these concessions, he went on, as a reward for the campaigns in which they refused to serve, nor for the secessions whereby they betrayed their country, nor for the slanders against the Senate which they have been so ready to believe. The conclusion they will certainly draw is that you are handing out these doles and gratuities because you are afraid of them and want to flatter them. And you will then find that there will be no limits to their disobedience, nor to their disputes and agitations they will stir up. In short, to take this step which you propose would be sheer madness. What we should do, if we have any sense, is to abolish the office of tribune outright, since its only effect is to undermine the authority of the consuls and cause dissension in the city. The truth is that Rome is no longer a single commonwealth as it once was. It has been broken into two, and I do not believe that the two parts will ever knit again, or become one of one mind, or cease to inflame and torment one another. These arguments and others in the same strain had a powerful effect upon the younger senators, so that Marcius succeeded to an extraordinary degree in inspiring them with his own passionate convictions. He also had most of the richest men on his side, and finally his supporters all cried out that he was the only man in Rome who would never be influenced either by the threat of force or the desire to flatter. In spite of this, however, some of the older senators opposed him because they could foresee where his policy might lead them. And it led in fact straight to disaster, for the tribunes had been present at the debate, and as soon as they saw that Marcius's motion was likely to be carried, they rushed out and joined the crowd, shouting out loudly and calling upon the people to rally at once and stand by their own magistrates. There followed a stormy meeting of the assembly, and when Marcius's words were repeated in public, the people were so carried away with fury that their first impulse was to break into the Senate house. However, the tribunes concentrated their attack on Marcius by laying a formal accusation against him, and he was then summoned by messenger to appear before the people and defend himself. When he contemptuously dismissed the officials who served this summons, the tribunes themselves went, accompanied by the aediles, to bring him by force and began to lay hands on his person. Thereupon the patricians crowded round him, forced back the tribunes, and actually struck the aediles. By this time, nightfall put an end to the general tumult. But as soon as it was day, the angry populace began to hurry and from all directions and gather in the forum. When the consuls saw this, they became seriously alarmed for the city's safety. They summoned a meeting of the Senate and urged them to consider what sympathetic proposals and conciliatory resolutions they could put forward to appease and pacify the people. They appealed to the House to remember that this was no time for standing on their dignity or for a jealous assertion of their rights, but that they were facing a moment of great crisis in the affairs of Rome, which demanded a policy of moderation and humanity. The majority of the senators accepted this advice, whereupon the consuls went out and did their best to reason with the people and calm their indignation, answering dispassionately the charges which had been brought against the Senate, and rebuking the people for their own violence only in the mildest terms. On the question of the price of corn and the way in which it should be supplied, they declared that there would no longer be any cause for dispute. At this news, the majority of the people allowed their anger to subside, and to judge from the serious and orderly attention with which they listened, they were well on the way to being won over. The tribunes then rose and announced that since the Senate was now acting with such moderation, the people were prepared in their turn to make any reasonable concessions. They insisted, however, that Marcius should answer the following charges. Could he deny that he had incited the Senate to set aside the Constitution and abolish the privileges of the people? Had he not refused to obey the people's order that he should appear before them? And finally, had he not insulted and beaten the aediles in the forum, and thereby done everything in his power to bring about a civil war by provoking his fellow citizens to resort to arms? In making this demand, they had two objects in mind. If Marcius were to curb his haughty temper, which would be quite contrary to his nature, and throw himself upon the people's mercy, he would be publicly humiliated. If, on the other hand, he followed his normal instincts, he would do something which would make the breach irreparable. It was the second eventuality which they hoped for, and they had correctly judged their opponent's character. Marcius came and stood before the people as if he intended to offer a defense of his conduct. and his hearers listened to him in dead silence, but instead of the apologetic language which they had expected, he began to speak with an offensive bluntness, which soon developed into an outright attack upon the commons. At the same time, both the tone of his voice and the expression on his face conveyed a fearlessness which betokened a total disdain and contempt for his audience. And at this the people lost all patience and began to show their mounting indignation and anger at his words. Thereupon Sicinius, the most outspoken of the tribunes, after conferring for a few moments with his colleagues, formally proclaimed that the tribunes of the people had condemned Marcius to death. And he ordered the aediles to take him immediately to the top of the Tarpeian rock and throw him over the precipice. But when the aediles came to lay hands on him, many people, even among the plebeians, felt that this was a terrible and outrageous act, while the patricians, who were beside themselves with grief and horror, hurried to the rescue, crying out loudly as they ran. Some of them thrust away the officers who were arresting him and got Marcius into their midst. Others stretched out their hands, since words or cries were lost amid the general tumult, to implore the people to show mercy. Before long, the friends and relatives of the tribune saw that it would be impossible to carry out his punishment unless they were prepared to kill large numbers of patricians. They therefore persuaded the tribunes to revoke the cruel and unprecedented penalty which their sentence carried, and not to use violence or put Marcius to death without a trial, but to hand him over and let his case be decided by the vote of the people. After this, Sicinius, adopting a calmer tone, asked the patricians what they meant by snatching Marcius away from the people when a resolution had been passed to punish him. The patricians countered by asking, "What do you mean by dragging away one of the foremost men in Rome without a trial, to execute a barbarous and illegal sentence?" "Well, on that score at least you will have no cause for complaint or grievance against the people," retorted Sicinius. "They agree to your request that the man should have his trial. As for you, Marcius, you are summoned to appear on the third market day from now to satisfy the citizens of your innocence, if you can, and they will then judge your case by vote." The patricians were content to accept this solution for the moment and returned to their homes with a feeling of satisfaction, taking Marcius with them. But during the period which elapsed before the third market day, which the Romans hold every 9th day and so call Nundinae, an expedition was sent against the city of Antium, and this encouraged them to hope that the trial might never take place after all. They calculated that the campaign might last long enough for the people to become amenable, and that their anger might be appeased or subside altogether once their minds were taken up by the war. However, a settlement was soon reached with the people of Antium, and the citizens returned home. The patricians were now filled with alarm and held frequent meetings to discuss how they could avoid surrendering Marcius without at the same time giving the popular leaders the excuse to stir up new disorders. Appius Claudius, who was generally regarded as one of the bitterest opponents of the popular cause in Rome, solemnly declared that the Senate would not only destroy itself, but would utterly betray its duty to the state if it allowed the people to use their voting powers to pass judgment on patricians. On the other hand, the older senators and those most sympathetic to the claims of the people contended that they would not use this power harshly or severely, but would show their moderation and humanity once it was granted them. They considered that it was not a question of the people's despising the Senate, but of believing that they were despised by it, and hence that they would feel themselves so much honored and compensated by the privilege of being able to try a senator, that they would lay aside their resentment as soon as this prerogative came into their hands. Accordingly, when Marcius saw that the Senate was torn between its regard for himself and its fear of the people, he asked the tribunes what were the terms of the accusation against him, and on what charge he would be tried if they brought him before the people. They told him that he was to be charged with usurpation of the authority of the Republic, and that they would prove him guilty of attempting to set himself up as an absolute ruler in Rome. At this he rose to his feet and declared that he would immediately appear before the people to defend himself on that score, that he offered himself freely to any form of trial, and that if convicted, he would submit to any form of punishment. But, he went on, be sure that you confine yourselves to the charge you have mentioned, and do not go back on your word to the Senate. The tribunes agreed, and it was upon these conditions that the trial took place. But when the people assembled, the tribune's first move was to insist that the votes should be cast not by centuries, but by tribes. The assembly by centuries, Comitia Centuriata, the traditional method of voting in the early republic, was essentially a military grouping of the people, and since it was based on the property qualifications weighed in favor of the upper classes, a majority within each century counted as a single block vote. There was a total of 193 centuries, of which the knights in the 5 highest property ratings comprised 98, a clear majority. By this maneuver, they ensured that the well-to-do and reputable citizens who served the state in its wars would be outnumbered by the poorest classes, who cared nothing for considerations of honor, but liked to meddle in politics. Secondly, they ignored the charge of usurpation, which was impossible to prove, and repeated their attack upon the speech which Marcius had made in the Senate, when he had opposed the reduction of the price of grain, and urged that the tribunate should be abolished. But they also introduced a new charge into the indictment, which concerned the distribution of the spoils captured at Antium. They alleged that Marcius had not paid into the public treasury the money raised from the sale of the plunder, but had divided it among the volunteers who had taken part in the operation with him. It was this accusation which disconcerted Marcius more than any other. He had never expected it, and for the moment was completely at a loss for a reply which would convince the people. Instead, he began to praise the soldiers who had fought in the campaign, but this served only to provoke an uproar among those citizens who had not and who were far more numerous. Finally, when the people came to vote, he was condemned by a majority of 3 tribes and was sentenced to perpetual banishment. The news of Marcius's condemnation was greeted with an outburst of public rejoicing, such as had never been witnessed even for a victory over a foreign enemy. And the people departed to their homes in a mood of triumph, while the senators were correspondingly downcast and despondent. They bitterly regretted that they had not done everything in their power to oppose the trial, whatever the consequences, rather than allow the people to assume such authority and then abuse it so outrageously. At this moment, there was no need for any of the privileges of dress or other signs of rank to distinguish the 2 classes. It was clear at once that the exultant look belonged to the plebeians and the downcast to the patricians. The only exception was Marcius himself, who was neither dismayed or humbled by the news. In his outward appearance, demeanor, and expression, he appeared to be the only man among all the patricians upon whom his misfortunes made no impression. But this apparent composure was based neither upon logic, equanimity, nor any intention of enduring his fate meekly. It was the product of a concentrated fury and indignation which, although this is not generally understood, is really an expression of intense pain. For when grief turns to anger, it is devoured, so to speak, by the flame which it generates, and any notion of humility or passive acceptance is utterly cast out. And so, just as a sick man seems to burn with fever, so the angry man seems to be full of energy, because he is suffering from a kind of inflammation, a swelling, and a throbbing of the spirit. This was Marcius's state of mind, as was soon made apparent by his behavior. His first action was to go home, where his mother and his wife greeted him with tears and lamentations. He took them in his arms, told them that they must bear this blow of fate with patience, and without any further delay set off for the city gates. Although the entire body of patricians turned out to escort him, Marcius took no possessions with him into exile, nor did he utter a single request, but merely walked out of the city, accompanied by 3 or 4 of his clients. For a few days he stayed alone at a country estate, while a host of conflicting impulses crowded into his brain. Urged on by his anger, none of these was inspired by any praiseworthy or constructive purpose, but simply by the desire to revenge himself on the Roman people. Finally, he decided to incite one of the neighboring countries to wage a destructive war against them, and the people whom he chose to approach first were the Volscians. He knew that they had great resources both in money and in fighting men, and he was confident that the recent defeats they had suffered had not so much weakened their power as increased their hostility, and made them long to renew their quarrel with the Romans. There was at Antium a man named Tullus Aufidius, who because of his wealth, his courage, and his noble birth, enjoyed the position and respect almost of a king among the Volscian people. Marcius knew that this man hated him more bitterly than any other Roman. They had often hurled threats and challenges at one another in the battles they had fought, and out of the rivalry and boasting which ambition often provokes among young warriors, a private and personal animosity had grown up between them, which went far beyond the hostility that prevailed between their respective peoples. At the same time, Marcius sensed that Tullus possessed a certain magnanimity, and also that there was no other Volscian who was so passionately determined to revenge himself on the Romans. In short, Marcius acted as a living illustration of that famous saying of Heraclitus: "It is hard to fight with anger, for whatever it wants, it will pay the price, even at the cost of life itself." So Marcius dressed himself in clothes which completely transformed his natural appearance, and like Odysseus, into the enemy's city he stole disguised. It was evening when he arrived in the town, and although many people passed him in the streets, none of them recognized him. When he had found his way to Tullus's house, he quickly entered, took his place by the hearth in silence, and covering his head, seated himself there without uttering a word. The people of the house were astonished at his behavior, but did not venture to disturb him, for there was an air almost of majesty about his bearing and his silence. But they told Tullus, who was at supper, of this mysterious event. Tullus rose from the table, walked over to the stranger, and asked who he was and why he had come. At this, Marcius uncovered his face, and after a moment's pause he said, "If you do not recognize me even now, Tullus, or if you cannot believe your own eyes, then I must act as my own accuser. I am Gaius Marcius, the man who has done you and the Volscian people more harm than any other. And the name of Coriolanus, which I bear, makes it impossible to deny the fact. This title is the one and only reward I have received for all the toils and perils I have endured. And it is a badge of my enmity to your country. This at least can never be taken away, but everything else has been stripped from me by the jealousy and insolence of the people, and the cowardice and treachery of the magistrates and the members of my own class. I have been driven out of Rome as an exile, and now I sit as a suppliant at your hearth. But I have not come to ask for safety nor protection, for why should I have risked my life in Antium if I were afraid to die? But to take revenge on the men who have banished me, and already I have made a beginning by putting myself in your hands. My brave Tullus, if you are eager to fight your enemies again, take advantage of my disgrace, and make my misfortune the Volscian people's good fortune. I shall fight even better for you than I have fought against you, because the most dangerous opponents of all are those who know their enemies' secrets. But if you are tired of war, I have no desire to live. Nor will there be any advantage in saving the life of a man who has for so long been your implacable enemy, but who now, when he offers you his services, turns out to be useless to you." When Tullus heard these words, he was overjoyed, and giving him his right hand, he said, "Rise up, Marcius, and take courage. In coming here, you have brought us a great gift, and you may rest assured the Volscians will not be ungrateful. Then he entertained Marcius at his table with every mark of kindness, and they spent the next few days discussing plans for the coming war. Meanwhile, Rome was in a state of turmoil. Marcius's banishment had done much to arouse a feeling of hatred for the people among the patricians. And at the same time, soothsayers, priests, and private individuals all reported a succession of prodigies which were too significant to ignore. One of them was as follows. There was a certain Titus Latinus, not a prominent citizen, but a quiet and sensible man who was by no means addicted to superstition nor pretentious exaggeration of his experiences. He had a dream in which Jupiter appeared to him and commanded him to tell the Senate that the dancer whom they had chosen to lead the gods' procession was a bad performer and thoroughly displeasing to him. Titus reported that the first time he saw this vision, he paid little attention to it, since then it had appeared to him a second and third time, and still he had taken no action. But not long after he had seen his son, a boy of great promise, sicken and die, and he himself had lost the use of his limbs. He related these events to the Senate after he had been brought there in a litter. And no sooner had he spoken, it is said, than he felt the strength returning to his body, and he rose to his feet and walked away without any help. The senators were astonished at his story and made an inquiry to the circumstances. They discovered that a certain householder had handed over one of his servants to fellow slaves with orders that he should be flogged through the marketplace and then put to death. While they were carrying out this punishment and were torturing the wretched man, whose pain made him writhe and twist his body into all kinds of hideous contortions, it so happened that the sacred procession in honor of Jupiter came up behind. Many of those who took part in it were roused to indignation by this inhuman spectacle and the agonized movements of the victim, but nobody came to his rescue. All they did was to utter reproaches and abuse against the master who could inflict such a cruel punishment. In those days, the Romans in general treated their slaves with great kindness. The masters worked and even took their meals side by side with them, and because they knew them so well, were more considerate towards them. For example, if a slave had committed a fault, it was considered a severe punishment for him to be made to take up the piece of wood which supports the pole of a wagon and carry it round the neighborhood. Any slave who was seen undergoing this punishment was disgraced and was no longer trusted either in his own or the neighboring households. Henceforth he was known as a furcifer, for what the Greeks call a proper support is rendered in Latin by the word furca. So when Latinus described his dream to the senators, and they were completely at a loss to identify this bad or unpleasing dancer who had headed the procession, some of them, because of the unusual nature of the punishment, remembered the slave who had been flogged through the forum and afterwards executed. Accordingly, after the agreement of the priests had been obtained, the slave's master was punished. And the procession and the public ceremonies in honor of the god were enacted a second time. This incident illustrates the foresight of Numa, who in general showed the greatest wisdom in specifying the correct procedure for religious ceremonies, and who very properly laid down the following regulation to ensure the people's reverent attention. Whenever the magistrates or priests perform any religious function, a herald goes before them crying out in a loud voice, Hoc age. The phrase means mind this. And it is intended to remind the people to give their whole attention to the sacred rites, and not to allow any pressure of business or worldly preoccupations to disturb them. The implication being that men's attention is seldom fixed, and most of their duties are, in a sense, extorted from them and effected under constraint. The Romans are also well accustomed to repeating sacrifices and processions, not only for the kind of reason I have described, but on far more trivial grounds. For example, if one of the horses which pull the sacred vehicles, which are known as tensae, should become exhausted and stumble, or if the charioteer should take hold of the reins with his left hand, they decree that the procession must begin again. And at later periods of their history, they have been known to perform a single sacrifice 30 times over because some omission or mistake was believed to have taken place. Such is the piety and reverence of the Roman people in religious matters. All this while Marcius and Tullus were secretly conferring with the leading men of Antium and urging them to go to war with Rome, while the city was still torn by party strife. At first, the Volscians' sense of honor restrained them from seizing this advantage, because they had only recently concluded a truce and accepted a cessation of hostilities for 2 years. But then the Romans themselves provided a pretext by issuing at the public games a proclamation prompted apparently by some suspicion or slanderous report, to the effect that all Volscians must leave the city before sunset. Some authorities maintained that Marcius himself tricked the Romans into this action by sending a man to the consuls in Rome to plant the false rumor that the Volscians had laid a plot to attack the Romans during the public games and set fire to the city. At any rate, this proclamation made the Volscian people more hostile than ever towards the Romans. Tullius did his utmost to magnify the incident and stir up the people's anger, and finally he persuaded them to send ambassadors to Rome with a demand that the territory and the cities annexed from the Volscians in the late war should be restored to them. When they heard these proposals, the Romans became angry in their turn and retorted that the Volscians might be the first to take up arms, but the Romans would be the last to lay them down. Thereupon Tullus summoned a general assembly, and after the people had voted for war, he advised them to call in the help of Marcius. He urged them not to bear him any grudge for the harm he had done them, but to rest assured that he would be even more valuable as an ally than he had been deadly as an enemy. Accordingly, Marcius was summoned and proceeded to address the people. His speech demonstrated that he was just as formidable an orator as his exploits had already proved him to be a soldier, and convinced them that in the art of war his intelligence was no less remarkable than his courage. They therefore appointed him to joint commander with Tullus, and gave him full powers to conduct the campaign. But as he feared that the Volscians would take so long to mobilize and equip themselves that he would lose the most favorable moment to attack, He left instructions for the magistrates and other principal citizens to raise troops and collect supplies. Meanwhile, without waiting for the formalities of enlistment, he recruited a band of volunteers from among the most adventurous spirits and made a sudden raid upon Roman territory. He achieved complete surprise and secured so much plunder that the Volscians could neither use it up in their camp nor carry it away with them. However, to Coriolanus the quantity of supplies which he captured and the damage or destruction which he inflicted upon the enemy's territory were the least important results of the expedition. Its principal consequence, and indeed his main purpose in undertaking it, was to blacken the reputation of the patricians in the eyes of the Roman people. For while he despoiled and devastated all of their properties, he took the strictest precautions to guard the estates of the nobles, and would allow no damage to be done to anything to be carried away from them. This led to bitter recriminations and clashes between the rival factions in the capital. The patricians accused the people of having unjustly banished a man of great ability, while the people retorted with the charge that their opponents were trying to get their revenge by encouraging Marcius to attack his own country, and were now reveling in the spectacle of others being made to suffer from the enemy's depredations, while their own property and sources of wealth outside the city were left completely untouched. After Marcius had achieved his purpose of sowing fresh dissensions among the Romans, and at the same time greatly increased the confidence of the Volscians, and taught them to despise their enemies, he brought his troops safely back to their base. Meanwhile, the Volscians had mobilized their entire strength with great speed and enthusiasm. The army they had raised turned out to be so large that they decided to leave some of the troops to garrison their cities, while the main body marched against the Romans. Marcius now left Tullus to decide which of these armies he wished to command. Tullus's reply was that, as Marcius was clearly as brave a man as himself, and had always enjoyed better fortune in his battles, he should lead the army that was to take the field, while Tullus remained behind to guard the Volscian cities and provide the supplies for the fighting troops. So Marcius, this time with a larger force under his command, opened his campaign by attacking Circeii, a town which was a colony of Rome. Here the people surrendered without resistance, and he did them no harm. He then proceeded to ravage the region of Latium, as he expected that the Romans would risk a battle to defend the Latins, who were their allies and had dispatched a succession of envoys imploring their help. But at Rome, the people showed no desire to fight. The consuls were reluctant to risk a campaign during the few weeks which remained of their term of office. And so the Latins' appeal was dismissed. Marcius then led his troops against the various Latin cities, those which offered resistance, namely Tolerium, Lavicum, Pedum, and later on Bola, he captured by assault. enslaving their inhabitants and plundering their property. But he showed great consideration for the cities which came over to his side of their own accord, and to make sure that his troops inflicted no damage upon them against his orders, he pitched his camp at a distance from them and kept away from their territory. When he finally captured the town of Bola, which is no more than 12 miles from Rome, great quantities of treasure fell into his hands, and he put almost the whole adult population to the sword. After this success, even the Volscians, who had been detailed to garrison their own cities, refused to remain any longer at their post, seized their arms, and flocked to join Marcius, declaring that he was their only general and that they would recognize no other commander. His name and fame spread throughout the whole of Italy, and people asked one another with amazement how the valor of a single man could, by the mere act of changing sides, bring about such an extraordinary transformation in the fortunes of two peoples. Meanwhile, in Rome, affairs were in utter disorder. The people refused to fight and spent all their time in devising party intrigues, making seditious speeches and blaming one another until the news came that the enemy had besieged Lavinium. It was here that the sacred relics of the ancestral gods of the Roman people, of the Romans, were stored, and it was indeed the birthplace of the Roman nation, being the first city ever founded by Aeneas. The news produced a complete and astonishing change of heart among the people, and an equally remarkable and unexpected one among the patricians. The people were now anxious to revoke the sentence of banishment against Marcius and invite him to return, but the Senate, after they had met and debated this proposal, decided to reject it. It is possible that they were determined out of sheer spite to oppose any measure which the people put forward, or that they did not wish Marcius to owe his recall to the people's favor. Or it may have been that their anger had turned against Marcius himself because he had now proved that he was the enemy of every class, in spite of the fact that he had been injured only by one, and was well aware that the most powerful and influential men in Rome sympathized and had suffered with him. When this resolution was made known to the people, they were helpless to proceed further, since they had no power to enact a law without a previous decree of the Senate. The news of the Senate's actions served only to make Marcius more resentful than ever. In his anger, he immediately raised the siege of Lavinium, marched upon Rome, and pitched his camp at the so-called Fosse Coluliae, which are only 5 miles outside the city. Although the first sight of his army spread dismay and panic among the citizens, it at least put an end to their quarrels, since nobody, whether consul or senator, dared to oppose the people's desire to recall Marcius. On the contrary, when the Romans saw their womenfolk running distractedly through the streets, and the old men prostrating themselves as they wept and prayed before the shrines of the gods, and knew that there was not a man in the city who was capable of inspiring them with courage or devising a plan of defense, then everybody agreed that the people had been right to attempt a reconciliation with Marcius. And the Senate, utterly wrong to give vent to its anger and its memories of past wrongs at the very moment when it would have been wise to put such emotions aside. Accordingly, it was unanimously resolved to send a delegation to Marcius to offer him the right to return to his country and implore him to put an end to the war. The men whom the Senate chose to make this appeal were all connected with Marcius either as friends or as kinsmen, and they expected at their first interview to be warmly welcomed by a man whom they knew well or who was at least a relative. Nothing of the kind happened. After being led through the enemy's camp, they were brought before Coriolanus, who was seated in high state, surrounded by the leading men of the Volscians, and who greeted them with an intolerably stern and arrogant expression. He then ordered them to explain the purpose of their visit, which they did in courteous and reasonable language, and in a suitably conciliatory manner. When they had finished, he answered them harshly. He began by pouring out his bitter resentment at the injustices he had suffered. Then, in his capacity as commander of the Volscians, he demanded that the Romans should restore the cities in the territory which they had annexed in the recent war, and at the same time pass a decree granting the Volscians the same civil rights as had recently been conceded to the Latins. Finally, he told them that there could be no lasting peace between the two nations unless it were based upon just and equal rights. He gave them 30 days to consider these terms, and as soon as the envoys had departed, he withdrew his troops from Roman territory. There were a number of the Volscians who had for some time envied his success and felt uneasy at the influence he had acquired. And this action provided them with their first opportunity to attack him. Among these was Tullus, not because he had been personally wronged in any way by Marcius, but because, being only human, he was angry to find his reputation totally eclipsed and himself ignored by the Volscians, who now felt that Marcius was everything to them, and that the other leaders ought to be thankful for whatever measure of power and authority he allowed them to share. It was in this way that the first seeds of complaint and denunciation were scattered in secret, and Marcius's opponents began to meet and compare their grievances. They called his withdrawal from Roman territory an act of treachery, not because he had betrayed cities or armies, but because he had thrown away an opportunity, which is the deciding factor as to whether these or any other prizes are won or lost. The fact was that he had given the Romans a breathing space of 30 days, and in war it is always possible for a decisive change to take place in far shorter time. However, during this month of suspense, Marcius was anything but idle. He attacked the Romans' allies, raided and devastated their territories, and captured 7 of their largest and most populous cities. All this while the Romans never ventured to send help to their friends. Their spirits were cowed, and they showed so little inclination for the war that you might have thought their limbs were paralyzed or benumbed. When the 30 days had expired and Marcius appeared for the second time before Rome with his whole army, they sent another delegation to implore him to relent, withdraw the Volscian troops from their territory, and then put forward whatever terms he thought best for both parties. The Romans would not give way out of fear, but if he considered that certain concessions ought to be made to the Volscians, all these would be granted if they laid down their arms. Marcius's reply was that as commander of the Volscians, he could not discuss this offer, but that as a man who was still a citizen of Rome, he strongly advised them to put themselves into a humbler frame of mind, reconsider what justice required of them, and come back in 3 days' time with a ratification of his original demands. If they should decide otherwise, they must know that it would not be safe for them to enter his camp again with nothing but empty phrases. When this delegation had returned to Rome and made its report to the Senate, it was plain to all that the ship of state was being tossed on the billows of a fearful tempest. And since the waves seemed about to overwhelm it, it was decided to let go the sheet anchor. A decree was passed that the whole order of priests, the celebrants or custodians of the sacred mysteries, and those who practiced the ancient and ancestral art of divination from the flight of birds should go in procession to Marcius, all of them dressed in the vestments used for the performance of their various functions, and should solemnly entreat him in the same manner as before to declare a truce then, and then discuss with his own countrymen what terms should be offered to the Volscians. Marcius went so far as to admit this deputation to his camp, but this was the limit of his tolerance. He spoke and behaved to them as harshly as before, and curtly reminded them that the Romans must either offer a settlement which complied with his original terms or else resign themselves to war. When the priests returned, the Romans decided that they would remain quietly inside their city, doing no more than guarding the walls and repelling the enemy if they attempted an assault. They resolved to put their trust above all in time and the accidents of fortune, since they could see no means of saving themselves by their own efforts. The city was full of confusion, terror, and rumors of disaster, until at last something happened which resembled one of those incidents such as Homer often describes, although people are usually unwilling to believe them. When some great and unusual action is about to take place, the poet declares in his lofty manner. Then in his mind the gray-eyed Athene planted this notion, or again, then some immortal changed his resolve by making him ponder the thought of what men might say. Or again, either because he suspected, or the god enjoined him to act. People are apt to despise Homer and to think that by introducing miraculous exploits and fantastic tales he makes it impossible to believe in the power of men to decide their course of action. But the truth is that Homer does nothing of the kind, for whenever an action is natural, normal, and the result of deliberation, he attributes this to our own powers, as we see in the phrase which he often uses. Then I took counsel within my stout heart, or again, such were his words, and Peleus' son was sorely afflicted, so that within his rough breast 2 counsels strove for decision. Or again, but she could never lure the noble Bellerophon out of his upright resolve. On the other hand, when he wishes to describe some prodigious or extraordinary exploit, whose accomplishment demands an element of supernatural possession or a sudden rush of heroic courage, Homer does not represent the god as depriving a man of his choice of action, but rather as guiding it, or on other occasions, not as implanting the impulse itself, but rather the idea which inspires the impulse. Thus he does not suggest that the deed is involuntary, but rather that the hero's will is set into motion, while courage and hope are added to strengthen it. And indeed, unless we are to rule out completely the idea that the gods can initiate or influence our actions, in what other way can they give us their help or support? They certainly do not manipulate our bodies or control the movements of our hands or feet. Instead, they make us aware of motives, or present images to the imagination, or thoughts to the mind, and in this way they either arouse the powers of decision and action in our natures, or else restrain or divert them. During these days of crisis in Rome, various groups of women went to all the temples in the city, but the greatest number and the most nobly born offered up their prayers at the shrine of Jupiter Capitolinus. One of these was Valeria, the sister of the great Publicola, who had rendered the state such immense services both in war and political life. Publicola had died some years before, as I have mentioned, but Valeria was still living and enjoyed a great honor and respect in Rome, since her life was seen to be in every way worthy of her noble birth. This woman then suddenly experienced one of those intuitions, such as I have described, and recognizing with an insight which must surely have been divinely inspired what would be the best course, rose from her knees and called upon the other women to accompany her to the house of Marcius's mother, Volumnia. She entered, and when she saw Volumnia sitting with her daughter-in-law, Virgilia, holding Marcius's children on her lap, she called her companions round her and said, "Volumnia and Virgilia, we have come to you as women to women, not because we have been ordered here by the Senate or the consuls, but because our God, as I believe, has listened to our prayers and put into our hearts the inspiration that we should turn to you. We are here to implore you to attempt something which will not only be the salvation of ourselves and the whole Roman people, but which will bring you, if you agree, a greater glory than was earned even by the daughters of the Sabines, when they converted their fathers and their husbands from mortal enmity to friendship and peace. Come now and go along with us to Marcius. Join us in entreating him to show compassion and help us to bear this true and just testimony for your country, that although she has suffered great wrongs from him, she has never, even in her anger, done or thought of doing harm to you, but restores you safe into his hands, even though he may grant her no better terms on that account." When Valeria had finished speaking, the other women added their voices to hers in appealing to Volumnia, who then answered as follows: "My friends, we share with you the misfortune which has come upon the whole Roman people, but we have another of our own. We have lost the glory and the virtue which Marcius once possessed, and we are forced to see him as a man who is imprisoned rather than protected by the arms of our enemies. And yet the greatest misfortune of all is that Rome has grown so weak that she must rest her hopes of safety upon us. I do not know whether Marcius will show any regard for us, since he has none for his country, which he once loved better than his mother, his wife, and his children. But in any case, take us. Make what use of us you can and lead us to him. If we can do nothing else, we can die offering up our prayers for our country." With this, she took Marcius's children and Virgilia and set out with the other women for the Volscian camp. They were a pitiful sight, and even the enemy greeted them with a respectful silence. It so happened that at that moment Marcius was seated on a tribunal with his chief officers around him. When he first caught sight of the procession of women approaching, he was filled with amazement. Then he recognized his mother walking at their head, and although he struggled hard to maintain his remorseless and inflexible resolve, he found himself overcome by his feelings. He could not bear to receive the women sitting, but jumped down from the tribunal and ran to meet them. He greeted his mother first, and clasped her for a long while in his arms. And then, when he embraced his wife and children, he could hold back neither his tears nor his affection any longer, but allowed himself to be swept away by a flood of emotion. When he had thus relieved his pent-up feelings and understood that his mother wished to tell him something, he called together the Volscian leaders, and they heard Volumnia speak as follows. My son, even if we were to say nothing, the wretchedness of our dress and our appearance should make you understand in what misery we have lived at home ever since you were banished. But now you must know that we who have come to you here are the unhappiest women alive. For fate has made that sight which should have been the most joyful into the most terrible of all, when Volumnia is compelled to see her son, and Virgilia her husband, turning his arms against the walls of his native city, and even to pray to the gods, which others may find a comfort in their misfortunes, has become impossible for us, since we cannot ask them in the same breath to make our country victorious and keep you safe. When we pray for you, we are calling down a curse upon Rome, such as the bitterest of her enemies could desire, and your wife and children are compelled to sacrifice either their native land or yourself. As for me, I shall not wait for the war to decide the issue for me. If I cannot prevail upon you to prefer friendship and harmony to enmity and strife, and thus become the benefactor of both countries rather than the scourge of one of them, then you must know, and let there be no doubt of this, that you shall never attack Rome unless you trample first upon the dead body of the mother who bore you. I do not choose to wait for the day when I shall be forced to watch my son either led in triumph by his fellow citizens or triumphing over them. If I were to ask you to save your country by ruining the Volscians, then I admit, my son, that you would be faced with a cruel choice, since it is neither honorable for a man to destroy his fellow citizens, nor just to betray those who have trusted him. But as it is, all we ask is to be delivered from the disaster that threatens us. If this is done, it will prove the salvation of both nations, but it will bring more honor and glory to the Volscians. They have shown themselves the superior in arms, and this fact puts them in the position of being the givers of the two greatest blessings, peace and friendship, while they themselves will receive no less. If this happy issue comes to pass, you will have done more than any man to bring it about. If not, you alone will bear the blame from both sides. And although the chances of war are always uncertain, this much is sure. If you conquer Rome, you will be your country's evil genius. But if you're defeated, the world will say that to satisfy your revenge, you did not hesitate to bring disaster upon your friends and benefactors. While Volumnia was speaking, Marcius listened without uttering a word. And after she had finished, he stood for a long while in silence until she asked him, "Why have you nothing to say, my son? Is it right to sacrifice everything to anger and resentment, but wrong to give way to your mother when she pleads with you in such a cause as this? A great man has no need to remember every wrong he has suffered. But a man who is both good and great should remember the benefits that children receive from their parents. And he should repay these by honoring and respecting them. Surely no man ought to value gratitude more highly than yourself, since you are so relentless in punishing ingratitude. And yet, although you have done much to punish your country, you have shown no gratitude to your mother. So it would have been an act of reverence on your part to grant what I asked without any pressure, when I came to plead in such a just and honorable cause. But since I cannot persuade you, I must use my last resource. As she spoke, she and his wife and children threw themselves at his feet. At this, Marcius cried out, "Mother, mother, what have you done?" Then he raised her up and tenderly pressed her hand. "You have won your victory," he told her. "You have saved Rome, but you have destroyed your son. This is my defeat, even though none but you could have defeated me." He spoke privately for a few moments more to his mother and his wife, then sent them back to Rome as they wished. The next morning he marched the Volscian army out of Roman territory. The Volscians themselves were variously affected by what had happened. Some of them blamed both the man and what he had done. Others who were in favor of a peaceful solution of the quarrel with Rome approved of both, while others again, although they were angry at his action, could not regard him as a traitor, and thought it inexcusable to have yielded so much irresistible pressure. At any rate, none refused to accept his orders, and they all followed him obediently, although they did this rather because they admired his courage than because they any longer accepted his authority. As for the Roman people, the end of the war revealed even more clearly the full extent of the terror and sense of danger which had oppressed them while it lasted. As soon as they observed from the walls that the Volscian army was withdrawing, every temple in Rome was thrown open, and the citizens decked themselves with garlands and offered up sacrifices as if they were celebrating a victory. But the Senate and the whole people showed their joy most of all in the honors and marks of affection which they paid to the women who they declared had proved themselves beyond any doubt to be the saviors of the city. However, when the Senate passed a decree to the effect that any honor or privilege which they asked for themselves should be granted by the magistrates, their only request was that a temple should be erected to the fortune of women. They offered to pay the costs of building this, provided that the state would undertake to carry out at the public expense all the sacrifices and other honors which are due to the gods. The Senate praised their public spirit, but nevertheless ordered the temple and its statue to be built at the expense of the state. In spite of this, the women raised money themselves and set up a second image of the goddess. And the Romans say that as this statue was placed in the temple, it was heard to utter the words, "Women, your gift of me is acceptable to the gods." According to the tradition that has come down to us, these words were not merely uttered but repeated. But to say this is to ask us to accept what is almost incredible and probably never happened. It is not difficult to credit that statues may have appeared to ooze with sweat, shed tears, or exude something which resembles drops of blood. Since wood and stone often gather a mold which produces moisture, and not only display various colors themselves, but take on other tints from the atmosphere, and there is nothing to prevent us from believing that heaven sometimes employs such portents to foreshadow the future. It is also possible that statues may give out a sound which resembles a groan or a sigh, which is caused by a fracture or splitting of the particles of which they may be composed, and produces a louder noise if it takes place inside. But the notion that articulate speech, so clear and abundant and precise, could proceed from a lifeless object goes beyond the bounds of possibility, since neither the human soul nor even a god has ever spoken or conversed without possessing a body which is organically constructed and fitted with the various vocal members. But in a case where history compels our assent by providing a large number of convincing witnesses, we are forced to conclude that the imaginative faculty of the soul undergoes an experience which was not really a sensation, but can persuade people that it was one, just as, for example, when we are asleep, we believe that we see and hear, although in reality we do neither. However, those who possess a deep sense of reverence for the divine and cherish religion so strongly that they cannot disbelieve or reject phenomena of this sort find a powerful support for their faith in the miraculous nature of the divine power, in the fact that its ways are not as ours. Yet the divine bears no resemblance to the human, either in its nature or the scope of its activity or the skill or strength of its operations, nor is there anything incompatible with reason in the fact that it should achieve what is beyond our power or execute what is impracticable for us. On the contrary, since it differs from us in every respect, it is in its works above all that it is unlike and remote from us. However, as Heraclitus remarks, most of the attributes of the divine escape our understanding through lack of faith. Now when Marcius returned to Antium from his expedition, Tullus, who had long hated and felt jealous of him, began to make plans to remove his rival immediately. For he was afraid that if Marcius escaped him now, he was never likely to give him another such advantage. He therefore gathered together a large body of supporters to oppose Marcius, and then summoned him to lay down his command and render an account to the Volscians of his conduct as their general. Marcius was alarmed at the prospect of returning to private life while Tullus remained in authority and continued to exercise a powerful influence upon his countrymen. And so he answered that as he had received his command from the whole Volscian people, it was to them that he should surrender it, if this was their will. Meanwhile, he was ready to give an account of his generalship to the people of Antium, if they desired it. So an assembly was summoned, and the popular orators as had been arranged, did their utmost to rouse the people against him. But when Marcius rose to reply, even the rowdiest elements in his audience fell silent and allowed him to speak freely, while the best of the men of Antium and those who were content with the peace made it clear that they were well disposed towards him and would judge his case fairly. Tullus now began to be afraid of the effect of his opponent's defense, for he was an orator of great power, and the services he had originally rendered to the Volscians far outweighed his recent offense. Indeed, the whole indictment against him was really a proof of how much they owed him, for they would never have become conscious of a grievance at not capturing Rome if Marcius's efforts had not brought them so close to success. So the conspirators decided that there must be no delay, and that they could not afford to wait to discover the feelings of the people. The boldest of them raised the cry that the Volscians must not listen to this traitor, nor allow him to keep his command and play the tyrant among them. Then they rushed upon him in a body and cut him down. And not a man stepped forward to defend him. But it soon became apparent that the conspirators did not carry the people with them. From every one of their cities, crowds flocked to Antium to see Marcius's dead body, and he was buried with full honors, and his tomb hung with arms and trophies as the monument of a hero and a successful general. When the Romans heard of his death, they took no action either to honor his memory or to condemn it, but simply gave their permission to the women of his family to wear mourning for him for 10 months, as was the custom when any of them lost a father, a son, or a brother. This was the longest period that was allowed for mourning, and it was fixed by Numa Pompilius, as I have mentioned in his life. It was not long before the Volscians had cause to regret Marcius's death. First of all, they had a dispute with the Aequi, who were their allies and friends, over which of the two nations should command their armies, and carried the quarrel to the point of bloodshed. Next, they were defeated by the Romans, and in this battle Tullus was killed, and the flower of the Volscian army perished. After this disaster, they were content to accept the most humiliating terms, become the subjects of Rome, and pledge themselves to obey her commands.